Well, we are going to go ahead and get started, and we may have a few more people logging in over the next couple of minutes, but I want to welcome you to the Waypoint webinar series called the Waypoint 55. And so we cover ministry related topics in 55 minutes or less, one per month. And we've been doing this series for 6 years now, trying to equip church leaders, in particular different areas in the church, to do their area of ministry better and to thrive in their area. And so tonight our topic is a missions related topic, which we have a couple of those per year, but other topics as well related to church safety and security or prayer teams, men's ministry, women's ministry, um, elders, elder training, and just a variety of different topics that rotate throughout the year. And so I'm glad that we've got people that are joining our webinar this evening. But if you have other people at your church that would benefit from being resourced by some training that they might not be able to receive anywhere else for their area of ministry, would love for you to invite them to join via our YouTube channel. If you just search for Waypoint Church Partners on YouTube, you'll find our channel, and we've got our all of our webinars organized into playlists. And so there are those just for prayer team ministries or missions ministry and so on. One of our recent webinars was caring for your missionary kids, how from a distance you can try and help the children of your missionaries thrive in their area. And we had some friends of ours. Amy is our presenter tonight, but Josh and Denise Beck helped lead that session for us, and is really well received. And so would love for you to check out those webinars, but also recommend the areas for other people in your church to check out in the area that they serve. So we always want to give a big thank you to Mid-Atlantic Christian University, who is the sponsor of our webinar platform, has been since we began 6 years ago. We've now got more than 100 training videos for leaders in churches around the Mid-Atlantic region. Of course, Mid-Atlantic Christian University serves the same churches and leaders. It's even in their name. And so we want to thank them for sponsoring our webinar channel. But tonight we are talking about how to debrief your own missionaries, and we are being joined by Amy Miller. And Amy is, we're going to get introduced to her here in just a second. But we've got even more people logging in. If you are logging in and would like to let us know where you're logging in from, it's good to know where people are coming from for the live in-person part of our channel. We've got several states um, represented already. But I want to introduce to you Amy Miller, who is my sister, but has served in this area of debriefing for a long time, and trying to equip um, mission committee, missions interested people at church to help their missionaries thrive, to care more for your missionaries rather than just caring about your missionaries. That's one of the constant themes of our webinars that we do for missions every year, is how can you make that transition to doing more than just caring about your missionaries, but actually trying to strategize and then execute simple strategies to care for your missionaries as a church, as a partner church of your missionaries. And so we're going to talk about debriefing, what it is, how it helps, and how you can do it. And so, Amy, thanks for joining us tonight from Joplin, Missouri. And I'm curious if you could just tell those who are watching tonight or on our after the fact on our YouTube channel, kind of your background in missions. I'm obviously familiar with that, but how did you get started in missions in the first place? And then your college experience that led you towards missions.
Sure. Yeah, probably like a lot of people, my interest started going on a short-term mission trip to Haiti, as is probably true for so many people when I was in high school. And then I went to Bible college, went to Cincinnati Christian University, which sadly no longer exists, but it was a great place to go. And I majored in missions and met my husband there. And then after college, we both went to Ireland for 4 years and served on a church planting team. We had done a couple internships during college as well. Matter of fact, that's kind of how we met and got together. Um, and then while we were living there, we had two of our kids, and we came back and we actually worked with Tim and Lisa at Forefront. And then after that, we went to Southeast Asia for 4 years. And so All of that happened before we started an organization called Training International. We started that about 17 years ago, and that serves churches and individuals both through training and coaching. And then after 4 years doing that, I joined a church staff in communications and then went back to train, but this time as the director of debriefing, because that's really, while I like all the other training that you can do, that's really where my heart was and what I love to do.
All right. Well, and tell us just a little bit also about the organization that you've recently started that has a side application, but very similar.
Sure. Yeah. So almost a year ago, I left Train and started a new company called Expat Resilience. And it's to provide similar services, but to the expat community. And that could even be people who are in like business as mission or B4T who can't go through traditional Christian organizations to do training just out of security, or just even for any expat abroad. There are some organizations that do that sort of thing, but I have seen a lot of our friends when we lived abroad who were there for, business or NGO had no concept of what training and debriefing was, that was not something that was offered to them. And so I have seen how they were really jealous that we got the kind of care and the training that we did. And so it just seems to be a need out there that I wanted to help fill.
I'm curious, when you came back from the mission field, two stints of 4 years each, what kind of debriefing you had or didn't have,
Hmm.
and but what was the genesis for starting Train International as a result of that?
Sure. Yeah. So after we were in Ireland for 4 years, we came back and we went to an organization out in Colorado called MTI for a week of debriefing, which we didn't really know what that meant. We just heard it was a good thing to do. And so we took our family at that time. It was us and we had two little kids. And little did we know that we really needed to process a lot from team conflict to worldview shifts and even some theology shifts and identity issues and changing marriage and family dynamics, as well as just even debriefing the ministry there. And I think what really made an impact on us was the fact that we felt very seen and heard and understood by the staff that was out there. And um, that really helped us process those 4 years that we were abroad. And so even though we had that great experience, when we came back from Southeast Asia, we did not do a debriefing. Partly it was financial because at that point, we had 5 kids. So bringing 7 of us back from overseas was quite costly. And we didn't have the funds, which I wish we had made the the effort to have done that because we then felt like we kind of floundered in processing those 4 years abroad. And so just having those two things to hold up next to each other, we could see how debriefing was so important. And we eventually did get debriefed, but it was quite a while down the road before we felt like we could do that processing.
Well, I'm curious as we just kind of dive into the world of debriefing that for those that are watching tonight in person, live, or on our YouTube channel later, if you could just give us a sense of what debriefing is. Debriefing is a word that I think a lot of people kind of know what it is, but it's probably a floating definition for a lot of people. So when you talk about debriefing, just let's first of all talk about what it is,
Sure.
and because it can sound so general that it doesn't sound all that important.
Right. And there are different definitions of debriefing and different approaches to how to debrief people based out of those definitions. For some people, it's just helping individuals to make meaning out of their experiences and to learn from their experiences, which is a huge part for me, what I want to see out of debriefing. For some, it's just helping people tell their story in a narrative way. And that is a kind of debriefing. Um, there are a couple that when I was with Train, and I still kind of am, I'm still an adjunct debriefer with them that we use. And one is pretty simple. It's to help people tell their story, examine their story, and steward their story. And that third part is really, um, I think, really significant in in that these people have had a significant experience, and we truly believe that God help orchestrate that, and that has purpose and meaning and a gift to them and to the church at large. And so we want to help them steward their story well. Probably maybe a more technical definition that I like to use that helps encompass like hopeful outcomes is to help them name and normalize the process of reentry and reverse culture shock, to help them understand the dynamics of major life transitions, to acknowledge and process their emotions, to gain perspective and uncover meaning about their experiences. And for me, one of the keys too is to discover tools that are helpful in any transition, so that debriefing has a longer shelf life than, that set amount of time that they're in debriefing. When I'm with train, we get the luxury of 5 days with people, and so there's a lot of space to be able to do that. Probably for people in this audience, you may not get that kind of amount of time with people, but you can still help them move along in their story, even if you only have a few hours, or maybe you'll have a couple evenings. But those are kind of the hopeful outcomes that I love to see in a debriefing as people go through it.
All right, that's great. So I forgot to mention for those who are watching with us tonight that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And so if you've got a question for Amy along
Mhm.
the way, as soon as you think of the question, go ahead and type it in. And we have a queue over on the side of our screen that I can moderate and try and either interject that at the right time or trying to answer it at the end of our time this evening. If we don't get the opportunity to answer it, we might also be able to answer it after the fact because we'll have your email with it. Uh, but
Mhm.
um, but if you have a question, use the Q&A button. You've already been using the chat button to say hello to the other people that are with us tonight. So we're glad people have done that. But for a question that I can address Amy on, as we get into the logistics of what debriefing looks like and how it should be done and how it should not be done, if you've got questions about that, please go ahead and hit your Q&A button. So Amy, I'm curious as you get into debriefing and those hopeful outcomes that you have. I'm curious, kind of what happens. I don't know where to go with this, but if people don't get debriefed, which I think there's unfortunately a lot of missionaries never do, either
Mhm.
they don't know it's available to them or they can't afford it, like you said, if to go to a debriefing professional debriefing setting where it's going to be costly, particularly if they got kids that have to fly as well, like you experienced. Uh,
Yeah.
what what does debriefing do for someone before we get into the how
Mhm.
is debriefing just sounds like you're having coffee with someone and say, so what happened? So explain for our people what what the debriefing does psychologically or emotionally for someone that goes through good debriefing.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. I think one of the first things it does as we help them name and normalize things, it helps validate their feelings. And that sounds maybe a little, I don't know, a little wishy-washy, not wishy-washy, but a little soft,
What do you
but
think?
honest, it really, because so many in my experience, and I've debriefed now hundreds of missionaries, when they come back, so many of them feel so alone and isolated and misunderstood, and like no one gets them, no one gets their experience. And especially because we do group debriefings mainly, for them to come in and realize that other people on other continents, in other countries, in other ministries get them and understand their feelings and the struggles they've been through. And there's a validation that you're not alone. What you've gone through, did impact you. And let's talk about that. So I think helping them make sense of confusing or difficult experiences is a big part of what we do, and making meaning from their experiences. I think it helps reduce psychological residue, helps them kind of unpack and categorize things. And really, at the end, we hope that it promotes resilience long term, especially as we equip them to deal with other transitions. For people who don't go through good debriefing, I think we see increased stress, um, probably rumination might be a good word, where they just keep replaying. We all do that, I think, as humans. We replay those situations where that didn't go well, or we wish we had done something different. They get stagnated in their growth. They get hung up on things that happened in the past and happened on the field. Um, and there can be a buildup of unresolved trauma. We are seeing a lot of trauma that's happening overseas, and people don't know what to do with that when they come back. And that results in a lot of feelings of isolation, which all of that can have a real negative impact on relationships, whether it's in the family unit, with their extended family when they come home, or the inability to really connect well when they come back or build good friendships. So not that debriefing is the be all end all. It's not the solution to all of those problems. But one thing is, I think it can do with you when you've got skilled debriefers, is it, or just even someone who is trauma informed, is it really helps triage trauma. Not that you get to be the one that helps them treat the trauma, but you refer them to someone who can. And I think that's a really important part of debriefing. Even for us, when I was on staff at Train, we did not have clinical counselors always in the room. Sometimes we did. And so we very much needed to know when it was appropriate to kind of create a boundary of what we were debriefing and what we needed to say, wow, that's really serious. I'm going to refer you to someone who is very skilled in that particular thing to help you through that, which we'll talk about some of that later tonight. But debriefing can at least have an outside perspective of someone saying, that's major. That thing that you just talked about, it was just kind of an everyday occurrence over there for you, maybe. That's actually really big, and you probably need to talk to someone about that. And that happens quite a lot, where I think for all of us, when things just become everyday, you kind of forget that some of them are really hard and difficult. And just to have someone else speak into that and say, that's heavy, let's figure out a way for you to unpack that more with appropriate people.
A couple things that you said I've written down. You said the phrase that, just want to make sure you clarify that. You said reverse culture shock. And I'm not sure if everybody understands what that is. I would assume that lots of people on mission committees think that when missionaries come home to America, that they are so excited and thrilled and happy to be home and everything is perfect when they get home. So when you talk about reverse culture shock, what would you talk about? How would you define that?
Yeah. So if you know anything about culture shock, it's very similar. Only the tricky thing about reverse culture shock, even for the people going through it, is you think you're going back to somewhere where you know that culture, you know the rules of the game, you're going back to people that you know. And so you think it should be easier than moving somewhere where you don't know anybody, you don't know the language, you don't know the culture. Uh, and so you get blindsided by the fact that you go through a similar process of feeling um, at odds with the culture, because reality is it's not the same anymore. If you've been gone for any significant amount of time, it has changed. And also you have changed. And so for someone to try to fit back in, it's not easy. And they go through a whole spectrum of challenges and emotions. And and I what you just said is so true. We've had almost the exact conversations with some people. A pastor, we were talking to him about what we did, and he was like, "Oh, so why do people need to be debriefed? Aren't they just glad to be home?" And we were like, "Well, for one, it might not be home to them anymore. They might not actually feel like this is home, and also, they probably are leaving a place and people they love. And so, this assumption that they're just so glad to be back in America and this great culture and all the things is a huge assumption." And usually not an accurate one. They might be glad. And we talk about this with our people as like talking in paradox, that you can be glad to be home and see your family, and also it can be really hard, and also you really miss being over there. And to give them permission to say both and not try to pick one, not try to say, I'm glad to be home, but I miss over there, but to say, I'm glad to be home and also, or this used to be home and also it doesn't feel like it now. And so reverse culture shock, there's a lot of great um, resources out there to describe it. Uh, and it would behoove you, if you're debriefing people, to get acquainted a little bit with what that looks like, and that it's very normal to feel. We talk about the 4 F's, and so you come back and you might have fun. You might feel like, I'm so glad to be back. I get to go to Target. I get to have pumpkin spice lattes, all that kind of fun stuff at the beginning. And then you go to flight, and that's where you want to kind of pull away and isolate. And you might go back to just looking at pictures of where you were and just want to stay in touch with the people in the field. And then you go to fight, which is you fight this culture, your home culture. You don't like the things that maybe your worldview and your values have changed some from being on the field, and you come back and you feel like you want to fight it. And then eventually, most people, not everybody, you get to fit. And that's where you kind of reconcile to back to this culture. Not that you love everything about it, and not that it's all like it was before, but you figure out how to navigate it again and how to find your place again. And what people are surprised to find out is often that process takes a couple years for anyone who's been on the field for a significant amount of time. But even for people who do short-term trips can go through that same process. It's usually a lot shorter. Uh, or people who've gone for an internship will come back and still go through that process uh, until they kind of fit again.
But I was thinking about my own experience when we came back from our pretty brief season in the Soviet Union, kind of the prototypical scenario of reverse culture shock, where we had we had a toddler on the field and went through potty training, and in the former Soviet Union, your options were very limited. And then we came home and went to Walmart, and there were 40 brands of diapers on a shelf. And I was not prepared for how overwhelming and weird that felt. But even more than that, to love the church that we went to, but at the same time, I was not in love with the American church. And I don't think people in the American church can always understand that dynamic of that people coming home to America may not love the American church like they did growing up. And
Yeah.
that's part of the reverse culture shock. You have to be careful that you don't make assumptions about them just loving being back in your church compared to the church and the field where they came.
Yeah.
And that we went through all that, making it okay and normal is a good thing, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a very, very common story with the missionaries that we debrief. You have some who come back and they're just so glad to be able to, worship in English again and be in a small group or, whatever. And also to to find that there are some things about the American church that are very difficult now. Even for us, like when we lived in Southeast Asia, we were involved in a house church for the last 2 years we were over there. And, it was about I don't know, 30, 40 adults maybe on the best Sunday and probably the same amount of kids, if not more. And just recently I was talking to one of my kids about that and how it was very hard to come back, and we started going to a church that was around about 2000. And yeah, it was great to have options and kids classes and all these things, um but it also was a trade-off for some things that they really missed. Some of that, really good friendships that were easy to make over there, and um, I don't know, just the camaraderie that we all had on the field together. It was a big switch, and that's very, very normal. So if you have people coming back, just know that's very normal. It's not like they hate your church. It's that they're trying to adjust to a different way of doing church that they haven't had to do, and they've seen something different.
Yeah. All right. Well, and before we get into, so how can we help those tonight that are watching feel somewhat equipped to start debriefing the missionaries from their church? You said the word that trauma happens on the field.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, would you define what you're saying when what trauma would be and things that you might be able to be trauma informed that you can say, you know what, you need to talk to someone about that. What define what some of those kind of things are?
Yeah. Now I am not a psychologist, psychiatrist, clinician, and so there's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. However, just interacting with enough people, we do have people who have been in war-torn areas. Who, like one of our families, who lived in an earthquake area, saw many dead bodies on a regular occasion, and kind of thought nothing of it. That was one of those one of those instances where we were like, I'm not sure that you were meant to just be not flippant about it, but it no longer impacted them in the same way. We're like, you probably need to go to talk to someone about that. That's a serious thing to carry it with you in your heart and in your mind. We have people who have been kidnapped. We have had people who had to be evacuated, with soldiers guarding them and shooting at rebels. Uh, those aren't the normal, but they do happen. But we also have a
Mhm.
lot of people who, just like here, there's infidelity, there's people who lose their faith, there are people who um, have seen a lot of suffering and they don't know what to do with that. And um, and so trauma comes in all forms. Like we've seen, I wouldn't say everything, but I've heard a lot. And
Mhm.
one of the things I have learned from one of our clinician who is on staff is he said, it's not your job to validate whether or not something is trauma. It's our job to validate their feelings about it, because trauma can have different definitions depending on who you're talking about. But if it was traumatic to them, then it's worth treating it.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. I would think on even a smaller level is if they're serving in a team that I've heard of a lot of times where just the team dynamics were not healthy
Yeah.
at best or really
Yes.
dysfunctional or damaging. And to come home, you don't want to badmouth the missionaries that you served with. But at the same time, you went through some really difficult, challenging times in a team context that you could need a lot of help with.
Yeah. And statistically, team conflict is one of the number one reasons why missionaries return. And again, yeah, it's like you don't want to come back and bash all your teammates or bash missions, and so you don't know where to go talk about that. It seems like it's not a thing you should do, and so a lot of missionaries don't, or they don't get a chance to process it well, and then it leaks out very toxically, and
Mm.
and they do, hate missions and hate their team and never want to go back and hate that country, and so debriefing hopefully can mitigate some of that. Again, it might not solve it all, but it helps them process that because that's a very normal, very common issue is team conflict. And
Yeah,
the other thing we're seeing is spiritual abuse as well on the field.
yeah. We've at our church we've experienced that with one of our partners that was very damaged
Yeah,
because of that.
yeah,
Well, let's shift gears very quick. We've had some people chime in some questions that I'm going to try and insert here in a minute. If other people have questions for Amy, would love for you to type those in the Q&A button, not the chat button. But Amy, if we could transition to for the time that we've got left to start talking about. So for people that are in a church, they're missions interested, serving on a mission committee, or they're friends with the missionary that might come home for an extended season to their area, to their church. How could you begin training them to start the debriefing process to become uh, at the very best not be harmful when they start having coffee with their missionary friends.
hmm
Uh, from the baseline is not to be an idiot and say, "Oh, I wish I wouldn't have said that to them." But even more than that, how they start being really helpful to help people down that road?
Sure. Yeah, there'd be a few different tools I would give you. I will quickly give a little plug for Train International that they do 3 and 5 day seminars on teaching you how to be a debriefer. So if it's something you think, man, I'd really love this to be a significant role that I get to play, yes, please go get some training. And MTI, I think, also occasionally does some training, so it's not just train, um, but since I've worked there, I have a bias toward them. Um, but I will give you a couple different frameworks. One is a pretty simple one, and this is used sometimes in education and counseling and team building. So it's not specific to debriefing, but it works very well for debriefing. And this will be included in the resources that go with the show notes. So it's the three-step model, and it's really easy to remember. And this is one of the reasons why I like teaching is because people can really hang their hat on it. It's what, so what, and now what. And that's kind of what you're going through, the process you're going through with the person that you are asking questions to. So what is just helping unpack what was the experience, what actually happened, um, just gathering facts and observations. And you're just trying to create shared understanding at that point and a foundation for deeper reflection with those other two questions. And so you're just going to ask some questions like, what happened during the experience? What were the key events? Who was involved? What did you observe? What was really important to you that happened over there? And so it's just really kind of gathering some data. And the second part is so what? And this is helping them unpack sort of the meaning of what they experienced and starting to see patterns. That's one of the pieces that I love to see when people have aha moments about patterns of their experiences. And so the goal really is to help them understand and explore the significance of their experience. And so here you are helping through your questions, you're helping them begin to interpret the events and how it affected them. And to repeat something I said earlier, this is a chance to validate their feelings without correcting their feelings. Because sometimes it's easy when um, I think sometimes one of the things that we see happen is people want to spiritualize experiences, and the missionaries themselves sometimes do this, and they'll go through something really hard and then flip real quick to a Bible verse about all things working together for good, which true, and also something can be really hard and hurtful. And so being able to validate their feelings without correcting them or trying to bring about the bright side yet. And it's really guiding them to find patterns that may show up in their experiences and and in their relationships and maybe even in their relationship with God and what they're learning from God. Um, so I think it's continually asking for observations about some of that data that you got from that first part of the what when you were asking them questions like that is so you got to listen really well so that you can refer back to things. So the kind of questions you would ask in this section might be, why does that experience matter to you? What emotions did you feel during that thing that you just described? What patterns do you see in events, behaviors, or conflicts, or your own reactions? And what might you have learned about yourself or others? What did you see um, God doing during that time? What went well and what didn't? And so you're asking sort of that so what about the what part. And then the third part is the now what. And this is how do you apply what you learned in future situations. Now this might not happen always in the first debriefing that you might have with someone, but maybe. But this is really helping them get to actions or next steps based on what was uncovered in those first two questions. And so it helps them kind of look forward a little bit and consider how they can apply what they've learned. And it helps make their reflection practical and growth oriented and not just like, well, I talked about my story for an hour and I guess that's it. That was good, but it helps them kind of have something to do or apply. This does kind of sometimes bleed over into coaching, and so you'll need to decide if that's a role that you want to step into. Maybe you don't feel comfortable, um, or maybe it's just not the right time to help move them forward because you don't want to do that too quick. Because if you turn that corner too quick, you might not have uncovered enough yet of in those first two sections. And also they might need some stuff that they got to get treated or they might really need to do some deeper work on that section, the second section, before they can go to the now what. But you can ask questions like, oh, if you could go back and do it differently, what would you do? Or what would you use from that experience um, moving forward? Or what's the one we like to ask too is what's the invitation here? What's God's invitation to you because of these things that you've experienced? Or how do you think he would speak over you because of those experiences and hearing his voice? And so we like to also talk about we go to the Jeremiah, is it 6:16? I should know it, 16:6, the inquiring of the Lord. And
16.
yeah, and so that's a verse that we use a lot, like inquire of the Lord of these things that you experienced. Ask him. He's not afraid of your questions, and so just being that agent of listening to them. You're not there to give answers, you're not there to give advice, but you're there to kind of guide them through a process. And so that three-step model is pretty I think it's pretty sound and it's a pretty easy one to remember. We in our 5-day debriefing, we do a lot of other things, but that will kind of give you a sense of how we want to move people forward through debriefing.
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, I would reiterate what you said. It's fine to suggest Train International as one resource. It's in Joplin. But the church where I belong and I serve on the mission team there, we have people on our team that have gone for training to be better debriefers. Uh, so that hopefully we get time at the end here to talk about short-term mission trips and how debriefing may change a little bit or be different. But we wanted to make sure that every team gets debriefed as they return to the States from a week-long or 10-day trip. But regardless of the kind, if we have missionaries coming back on furlough for several months, we try to meet with them and help them early on in their furlough so that they're not stuck in an area or get too many poor questions asked of them. So that would be one question I would ask you is how can you debrief poorly? Maybe is what should you not do accidentally, unwittingly,
Yeah.
as you meet with someone for a session or two when they've returned to the States?
Yeah. And this goes for even people like myself. I'm going to say that I learned this the hard way. And so it's a piece of advice or not just advice, but training to our own facilitators is learning how to hold your own story well. So a caution is, yeah, I'll explain that and then we'll talk about the caution. But so what I talk about when I talk about debriefing, it's not a casual conversation, but like I said, you're kind of moving the other person through their story with a purpose. And and there are times that you might want to share a little bit about yourself to build credibility or connection. Um, and I find that we overestimate how much we need to share to do that. Um, but there's something to be said about establishing rapport and gaining trust. And sometimes there might be something that happened in your life that you could use as an illustration. However, if you find yourself talking very much during a debriefing, you're probably talking too much. The debriefing is not about you, it's about their story and it's about them and helping them process. Um, and it's very easy. Like if you're interacting with this person who gets you, like if you've done missions before and all of a sudden now like you find someone who shares that same passion and um, that same connection, you might be tempted to share your story and a very human desire for connecting with them more. Like that's normal. But when you're a debriefer, that is not the main goal. And so one of the triggers for me and that I have trained other debriefers on is if you find yourself um, sensing that you need a reaction from them about anything that you share about your story, or if you feel like you need them to affirm your experience or parts of your story, or you need some sort of emotional something to happen, then you're not ready to be a debriefer because you haven't fully processed that part of your story. And so you need to find your own debriefer. And I would like as debriefers, that's one of our rules at Train was debriefers need their own debriefers. And you need to have been debriefed before you can sit in that chair. And so I would encourage anyone who wants to do this on a regular basis, find someone to debrief you first so that you can hold your story um, kind of over here when you're debriefing someone else. You're not holding it in between you. And um, I think there's a difference between being in your story and with your story. So when you are still in your story, you're still emotionally triggered as you narrate the experience that happened to you. When you're with your story, you can tell it without being drawn back into it. And it's now a tool for connection or rapport. You can, if you're in tune with yourself, I want them to minister to me, or, I want some emotional reaction from them. And one of the examples that one of our guys gives is that he was an ER nurse before he became a debriefer, actually before he went to the field. He was on the field for like 13 years. But one of the things as an ER nurse that they talked about was being able to put your feelings in a Tupperware to visualize putting if you're starting to feel like emotions well up in you as they're telling their story or any part of your story that you tell is to visualize putting them in a Tupperware and setting it up on a shelf. You can go back to it later. You can open it up later, but it doesn't need to be open while you're in the midst of debriefing. And for some people, that's a helpful visualization. It's like not denying your own experience or your own emotions, but it's just like they're not they're not needed right now. That is not the tool I need to use in this debriefing situation. So that's one thing I would encourage people is to learn how to hold their own story and to be debriefed if you have previous. I think people need debriefed from all kinds of life situations, not just the mission field. I'm a big proponent for that. Um, and kind of as an aside, I'd also say when a mission worker is silent as they're telling their story, it can be tempting to jump in and reword or try to suggest an answer or whatever. But you need to understand that that silence belongs to that person and it's detrimental if you take it away because they're processing probably something really important and deep, as we all would be when we're telling an important story and we pause. It can be really frustrating if somebody jumps in and assumes things. But as a debriefer, you've really got to learn to be quiet or be comfortable with silence. And we practice that. Like, do you know how long a minute feels like when you leave that to be just silent in a conversation? It's a long time. But we practice that because for internal processors, like your verbal processors are going to jump in right away and they're going to have a lot to say. But internal processors need that silence to get to the thing that they want to say. So that's another thing I would say as you practice debriefing, you got to learn to be comfortable with the other person's silence and just shut up, just don't jump in, give them time.
Yeah, all right. Well, let's switch gears just a little bit to someone that's been on the field for quite a while and they're coming home for good or for an extended period of time to what a lot of the people that'll be listening to our webinar tonight will be how can they try to debrief short-term trips that they've been to Haiti or you name the place, but it's been an 8-day trip or a 10-day trip and people they're coming back to the States, coming back to their church. How can they think about uh, that setting to help those people process where they've been?
Sure. I think first of all is just acknowledging that even a short-term trip can be very significant because some people will, maybe write that off like, well, you're only gone a week, how much could have changed? But a lot can change in someone's heart, in your worldview, in your understanding of the global church, and maybe even a perspective looking back on your home culture, on the American culture, and seeing some things very differently. And so first is just even understanding that it is an important thing to debrief. And just I think mechanically also set clear goals for your debriefing. Um, Maybe having some outcomes of just processing the challenges and the joys and the lessons or understanding some lessons that they felt like God was teaching them during the trip. And so it's not just ramble about your story, but we want to pull some things out of your story that are significant. I think that's helpful to set some parameters. I think this is also an attachment that's in the show notes of maybe some 10 tips. I think I put that in there of debriefing short termers. And so, again, the what, the so what, and the now what can still be a helpful framework when you're doing that. Learning how to ask good, thoughtful, open-ended questions. Um, and I think that's also in the notes. We talk about that, and there's some really easy questions that are accessible for people when you're learning to debrief that don't feel too awkward. Um, I think also not downplaying the fact that some of them are going to have post-trip challenges because of that short amount of time where maybe some significant things happened. Um, they've got a lot of internal work to do now of do they need to readjust? Do they need to uh, figure out how to fit back at their home church or among their family who didn't have this experience? And that dissonance is one of the most challenging things for people, I think, is figuring out, like, especially with family and friends who didn't experience the thing, this tendency to want to convince everybody the things you learned. Well, if they haven't seen it, it's hard for them to learn it. And so they can now feel the person who went can often feel very isolated and like nobody gets them, even when they were only gone for a short amount of time. And I think one of the things that's really helpful is encouraging people who went on short-term trips to take action when they come back, like figure out how they're going to plug in. Are they going to be part of the mission team? Are they going to advocate for a people group, maybe that they now have faces and names that belong to, like getting them to act on the things that they saw and they learned and have felt is really important.
Yeah, I know for the trips, our church takes many trips a year, and still to this day, I've been on 20 plus trips, still try to process, third world poverty, and that the worst place in America is better than most places around the world, and so helping people process that relatively quickly because they're going to go back to work or school, and people are just going to kind of forget about it. But man, back behind the scenes, you've had to deal with being in a place that was so different from ours, and so that experience of debriefing your short-term trips is so important.
Hmm.
I thought before when you and I talked earlier this week, there's that trite saying, but I think it's really the way that I think of it is that saying that says impression without expression can lead to depression.
Yeah.
That if you don't, if you're impressed by your trip but don't get a chance to kind of get it out there and work with it,
Hmm.
uh, things happen psychologically inside of you. And so the one thing that one of our rules that we try and hold is that's the mechanics of it is always schedule your debrief before the trip. Because once
Yes.
the comes home, you will never get everybody back in the same room unless it's on the calendar, and if or you'll be chasing cats for weeks and months.
Mhm.
And so if you're going to have regular trips for your church, going to one of your missionaries to Haiti or the Dominican or fill in the blank, make sure that there is and I don't know if you have a suggestion, Amy, for how long after the trip debriefing should occur, within days or a couple weeks later, a couple months later. Is there a optimal time?
With short-term trips, probably the sooner the better. Just like you're saying, because people go right back to their old lives very quickly, and it can become like this distant memory that you went and did this thing. And so I think a short trip, do it closer. For people who are gone for a whole summer, like I've helped debrief college students who've gone on internships, and they're usually back about 6 weeks to 8 weeks before they do a debriefing, and that's a good amount of time for them to start to feel reverse culture shock, and so we can debrief that. They now have something to kind of hold their experience up against because they've come back and they are now comparing lots of things. For people who've been gone for years, we say that the sweet spot often is somewhere around 4 to 6 months. We'll have people who come like a week after and they're not quite ready to do that kind of work. But we've had people who've been back for 20 years who come and do debriefing and it's still beneficial. And
Mm.
so there's never a wrong time to debrief. There's just sometimes that are going to be a little more optimal than others.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, we've had some people ask some questions here that we could try and ask here to you in person. One would be, do you see that people in a couple or a family come into reentry at different paces, and how do you deal with that? That a couple comes debriefing, but they're in different places. How does that work?
Yes, we do talk about that when we do debriefing, and at Train we do whole family debriefing in that we do adults and kids, but not all together at the same time. But the curriculum follows a very similar path. But we do talk about that with couples, and we talk about it with parents with their children. You're individuals. You're going to process differently. That was the best experience of my life. I loved everything about it. Couldn't, I wish we could go back. And the other person to say that was horrible. That was the worst thing that happened to me. And so one practical step we say is you are not allowed to correct the other person's story. That's their story, their narrative. They need to tell it the way that they need to tell it. And there needs to be safety for them to tell it honestly. And that's very common for the stories to be different. There'd be a lot of similarities, but even between parents and children and siblings, like our TCK team would say, that was a rule they gave siblings was you're not allowed to correct your sibling. Like they get to tell the story the way they need to tell the story. Now, are all the facts always exactly right? Maybe not, but the feeling and the impact is theirs. And so we do talk about that a lot. Um, but still, we see it where, one person might kind of control how the story is told. And so we really work to kind of let the other person, draw them out and tell how it impacted them and tell their version of it. But yes, that's a common dynamic.
See parents wanting to not 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 in a bad way, but control the narrative of what their kids think the experience was.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think sometimes that's the advantage of having the adults and the kids in separate programs is there are times that kids will want to process stuff or be like, well, I never wanted to go to the field anyway. And we felt like we were the little trophy kids and we always had to do everything right. But they would never say that maybe to the parents' face, but they need to process how that felt to them, or sometimes it's good stuff. I hate to bring up all the negatives, but honestly, that is probably more the case is parents want to control anything that looks bad on their family, looks bad about the country, looks bad about the church. Um, and so kids feel very shut down in what they can tell.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
And probably not good psychological effects to have that kind of pushed down and not expressed. And so
Yes.
we're going to need counseling eventually, sooner or later,
Right.
Uh, so,
Yeah. There
uh,
should be a fund for that for every missionary family is therapy for their children.
yeah. Well, Maria asked another great question is, can you do some of this while missionaries are still on the field?
Mm.
Rather than waiting to debrief is how helpful you can be while they're on the field.
Yes, for sure. And we have people who come to our debriefings when they're on furlough. And so they're not exactly on the field, but they're still, they're not back. And it is very helpful because it helps with sometimes with course correction or just clarity on should they even still be there or if they're going to continue some things they need to work on. And so yes, absolutely. I think an annual debrief would do a lot of good for all humans, but particularly for anybody on the field, just to continue to have that touch point for someone to care about what's been going on. A lot can happen in a year. But yes,
I know that the church where I get to serve, we take almost a trip every year to each of our five partners, and there's no agenda other than come hang out with you for several days. And missionaries aren't prepared for that because they think we're going to come do something. But our hope
right.
is to do some of these debriefing questions about what's God doing in your life, where are you struggling, where are you thriving, those kinds of things. And most of our missionaries, it took them multiple trips before they think we're just going to come care for them for a few days and try and
Yeah.
help them move along through their ministry in hopefully
Hmm.
a somewhat healthier way. Well, Roger Carr asked a question about that we can kind of finish up with our time is debriefing. He talked about the debriefing that we see in Acts 14 with Paul's first mission trip, and I don't know if you can refer to that, but that debriefing allows for, how would you describe debriefing allowing not just for better mental health coming out of the mission field, but actually setting you up for better ministry moving forward, whether it's stateside or going back to the field someday?
Sure. Yeah, I think anytime we can process things that have happened to us, in a healthy way, we learn things from it. We learn things about ourselves. We learn things about the church, about God, about how we interact with other people, which will always put us in a better position as we move forward. Yeah, I love the Acts 14. I also love for anybody who wants to find some biblical precedents because debriefing is not a modern day invention. Go to 1 Kings 19 and watch how the Lord debriefs Elijah and just try to observe. It's a fun exercise to go through like how all the ways that the Lord ministers to him and it's very holistic. And one of the things that we love is that Elijah gets to tell his story twice, and the first time God doesn't correct him. God lets him rant and say these things that are absolutely not true. The second time God comes back and says, "Well, actually, let me correct some of your thinking about this." But the First Kings 19 story, also Acts 14, Jesus does it with the 72 who comes back. He does it with the on the road to Emmaus. There are like little glimpses of ways that debriefing is woven throughout Scripture, and so it's not something we just us modern people thought was a good idea. It's been going on a long time.
Yeah, even before the American church came about.
Yeah,
So yeah, we did not invent it. So
yeah,
that's good. Well, our time is up, Amy. Thanks for joining with us tonight and kind of sharing from your experience. I hope those that watch this webinar feel a little bit more confidence that they can help their missionaries really make sense of where they've been and make sense of where they can go as a result. That invitation, I like the way you said, what's the invitation God is giving you because of your experience? You wanted
yeah.
to interject something.
Just one thing, I would highly recommend anybody to look over in the resources. There's a page that's how to stay in your lane or when to refer, and it was written by a former missionary who's a clinical counselor now. Who we had him drop this document. It's just a way to know. when you should be looking for professional help for the person you're debriefing. And that's so important. Don't try to be the hero in a lane that you're not supposed to be in. Let somebody else do that. So I just wanted to give that reminder to look at that resource because it's really important.
Yeah, you can more harm than good if you don't refer when the trauma needs to be dealt with by a professional. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for that. And there will be show notes that are associated with this. And if someone want to contact you, is there a good email address that they could contact you at?
Yes, there is. You could do, I'm gonna have to spell it out. It's Six Millers, which is SIXMILLERZ at Gmail. It is
Okay.
probably the best one right now, other than my business one, but you'll probably want to go to my personal one.
Millers with a Z at gmail.com. And you can
Yes.
ask Amy more questions about how to debrief your own missionaries well so that they get to thrive on the field and when they return. So Amy, thanks for your time and for your experience that you've shared with us tonight.
Glad to do it. Thanks.
Yeah. For the rest of you tonight, hope that you'll stay tuned for future missions webinars. We'll do 2 of them a year, so 2 more coming up in 2025, thanks to our partner, Mid-Atlantic Christian University. But also hope that you refer other ministry leaders in your church to the other webinars that help equip them to thrive in their area of ministry. Thanks for your time tonight, and we hope to see you all again soon. Have a good night.